This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com, and I have with me this morning Charles Hugh Smith, very well-recognized writer on the web, who, amongst many things, is publisher of the website of2minds.com. Good morning, Charles, and welcome back.
Thank you, Gordon. Glad to be here.
Well, I heard that you were out doing a little snowshoeing in Yosemite. How was it?
Wonderful. Can't beat fresh snow and unbroken trails.
Last time we talked, you were just back from France, and so this time you're back from Yosemite. So any surprises on getting back in terms of the economy?
Just the ability of the status quo to kick the can down the road, for the fifth year running.
It is amazing. This time last year we were doing the themes for 2013. Today we're going to talk about your themes for 2014. And when you and I were reviewing last year's theme, what was consistent when we went through them, you were right. You were right smack on, but the government was successful in kicking the can down the road in many cases, and the problems are still there, but maybe worse. For the sake of time, Charles, do you want to kick it off? I've got your first slide up of 6 trends that you've isolated for us this year.
Well, Gordon, someone listening to our shows this year and the other shows you've done with people like Richard Duncan could assemble 25 or 30 major trends, and I've selected a very few just to kind of focus on for our show today. And trend number 1 is the number 1 growth industry in the private sector will increasingly be lobbying the government for favors. And we see this, say, for example, in Obamacare, where the competition that is that's supposed to be enhanced in healthcare is basically non-existent. These are like healthcare service cartels managed by the state, and that's the direct cause of the unaffordability of healthcare in the U.S. And the driver is when the state selects the winners and losers throughout the economy, companies are forced to make their case for special dispensations via campaign contributions and unrelenting lobbying. In other words, getting out there with a better product and more transparency on how your product is priced. That's not the way to make money in America anymore. It's to go and hire lobbyists and give millions of dollars to Congress people and sway them into giving you favors.
It's almost inevitable that the system starts to mutate to this if we don't stand on guard. And the terminology I use for it is crony capitalism and corporatocracy that then creeps in. And in the way, Charles, that I look at it, capitalism is about more for less. By all of the systems that are put in place as companies competing, they give us, the consumer, more for less. When you change the system and you go to crony capitalism and corporatocracy in the fashion you're talking, where the government does the dispensation, what you end up getting is less for more. And you pay more and you get a lot less in the services. And that's the shift that will inevitably happen with the things you're describing. And I challenge our listeners to look around, and if that's not what they're already starting to see happening.
That's a very good summary. And that's certainly been the case with Obamacare. And I did an analysis for my wife and I, and we're both self-employed. And if we went with Obamacare, it would cost us $8,600 more a year and push our just the healthcare costs, never mind the deductibles and out of pocket, to like $24,000 a year, which is, I could buy a house with that amount of money.
The other thing that comes out of this, Charles, is inequality. What happens, people start to see that there's favoritism that's created in the government, or favors, I'll use again the word crony capitalism. And so they then begin to see it as being unfair because their standard of living is not increasing. They're seeing that they're getting less for more. And when you start to see inequality or fairness, then what happens is you begin to see social unrest. And so I think we're at the early stages where you're going to see building social unrest. And maybe not as prevalent here in the United States, but certainly I'm seeing it around the world. It's growing. And it's because of exactly what you just described.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And the drivers aren't going to go away.
No, if anything, I would suspect they're accelerating.
The trend number 2 is the decline in local government services will accelerate as rising pension and healthcare costs squeeze local government budgets. And I think everyone in the U.S. will be directly impacted by this because we all live in a city or township and county and state, and as all of these local governments face the combustible collision of rising pension and healthcare costs and the angry taxpayers tired of service cuts, we're going to see a continuation of accounting trickery, higher fees and taxes, and a decline in the services provided because the local governments really have no choice. If they're going to maintain the promises made on pensions and healthcare for government employees, they're going to have to cut services and raise taxes. And that's a volatile combination.
I believe we're in the midst of a global and certainly United States pension crisis. It just hasn't made the press yet, and we haven't seen the defaults coming. But, the pensions are so seriously underfunded that it's not possible of having them properly funded. They're using fictitious 8% kinds of targets. They're not making 8%. We've spent 5 years sort of thereabouts trying to shore up the balance sheets of the banks. And let's assume for a moment that we've been successful in that. I don't believe we have, but we'll accept that. But what we have done is we have not solved those who need yield, and that is pensions, insurance companies, etc. And they're out of runway right now. And so with 75 million baby boomers, 10,000 a day retiring here in the United States, it's like a giant Madoff moment coming of a Ponzi scheme where that money has to be paid out and it's not there. And I was reading the other day, the largest pension plan in the world, which is Japanese, changing fiduciary responsibilities or outlines so that they could buy more equities versus bonds. As you know, they're always bond-oriented. So the only way out now is the government to drive up the stock markets to bail out the pension plans because you can't keep, tapers not helping them. That makes sense to you? Because it is this crisis that you're pointing out.
Yes, Gordon. I think you've nailed another theme, which is that trying to save the pension funds by creating a bubble only leads to a collapse of that bubble, which would then exacerbate the pension crisis that you just described.
And it is a crisis, and there's only one solution available, and politicians will always take the easiest way out. I'm not optimistic, and that leads to your point on this, in my mind, with the local governments, state, city, and local, who have got these pensions that are completely unfunded in many cases. In the interim, they're going to have to go through massive cuts to try and keep them somewhat solvent, but they'll end up like Detroit and the rest of the cities at some point. And maybe another massive set of bailouts that'll help fund the new round of quantitative easing, maybe bailing out state and local governments and increasing the Fed's balance sheet. I'm speculating there. I can see all of these themes coming together. Charles.
Yeah, I think that's something to keep an eye on because that's going to be a natural a natural kind of consequence of the pension crisis. Well, trend number 3 is credit creation will decline, removing the engine of expansion in a debt-dependent consumer economy. And when income is stagnant for the bottom 90% of households, credit expansion is the only game in town. In other words, how do you create more demand? Well, in the good old days, that demand was the result of rising incomes. Well, now that incomes for the bottom 90% have been stagnant for 40 years, then the only other trick was to lower interest rates to near zero so that more debt could be leveraged up on the same income. But that, now that we've had low interest rates for years, that game has run out of steam as well. And so now there's no basis left for more credit expansion. And since the stock market has has been tightly correlated with credit expansion. If credit expansion declines, then we can assume the stock market will also turn down, regardless of what the Fed does.
Problem right now with credit creation, when I really look at it, Charles, is that the reason it can't keep expanding, and it's certainly going to collapse from the consumer standpoint, is for somebody to lend, borrow money, or debt, there needs to be collateral. And there's no longer sufficient collateral to sustain the rate of credit growth for the money to be put out. Somebody's got to post, whether it's secured or unsecured, but it's at a level of collateral, because all the collateral is so over-encumbered, it is in fact devaluing right now. And the way you create capital is you create wealth, and that is the capitalist system through savings. You can't print it. It's not money. Money's and paper that we print's an IOU. Capital can only be created by either building it, growing it, or mining it. You don't print it. So that's the problem. It's just collateral can't sustain the credit growth.
Yeah, and it's good to remind ourselves that virtually every aspect of the U.S. economy is dependent on credit expansion. When the local government wants to build a new school or repair a road, they float a bond, which is debt. If a household wants to buy an auto or send a child to college, more debt. It's incredible how dependent we are on credit expansion. So if that rolls over or even stagnates, the economy will definitely take a turn down.
Yeah, I don't even think it has to roll over. It just rate needs to slow. It's at the margin. A slightly lower rate in itself will be crippling. If it was ever to actually roll over or to start to fall off, it would be just devastating. But right now, I think the biggest issue is just if it's been increasing, going exponentially. If it was just to go arithmetically, a problem. So which tells you we're still in the early stages.
Yes, of the longer trends that you have been describing, in these programs for the last 2 years. So trend number 4 is middle class income, purchasing power, and discretionary income will all continue to stagnate. And we know from charts that real income, meaning income adjusted for inflation, for the bottom 90% has actually declined about 7% since 2000. So that means in terms of what your money can buy, what we call purchasing power, most of us have actually lost 7% of our income, which is not insubstantial. And another point to be made is discretionary income is what's left over after you pay for all the essentials. Your mortgage, your rent, your auto payments, your gasoline, your heating bills, and college student loan debt, and so on. And of course, as local governments and the federal government raise fees and taxes, and as your healthcare costs go through the roof, even if your income has stayed has not declined in real terms, it's being eaten up by the essentials and leaving you less money to spend on other stuff or to save.
This is a huge problem, Charles, because it's not just a United States problem. It's going on right around the world of shrinking and compressing disposable income. And what it means is that when you have that happening, you have a shrinking aggregate demand. And when aggregate demand starts to shrink, it unfortunately forces something called a liquidity trap. We've seen this happen. It's rare, but we've seen it happen in many countries, many sovereigns. It's my opinion that we're about to see it in the next few years for the very first time appear on a global basis, and to see a global liquidity trap because of the massive labor arbitrage that's compressing and productivity paradox that's compressing disposable income and therefore aggregate demand. I didn't mean to be doom and gloom, but these points are symptoms of a massive tsunami, of a wave, of a problem that we're not addressing.
On trend number 5, and I just kind of cherry-picked this trend out of many possible geopolitical trends. This one is African oil exporting nations will move from the back burner to the front ranks of geopolitical flashpoints, joining the South China Sea, Mideast, and North Korea. And what a lot of people may not be aware of is that Africa's oil boom is very significant. There's perhaps the largest new easily exploitable fields of oil and natural gas are being found in Africa. And this is creating a lot of political instability within Africa for the reason that many people call the resource curse, that when you discover oil and then a lot of things get distorted by that. The political system becomes dominated by crony capitalism. Other parts of your economy are basically left to starve because all the money and political power is chasing the oil revenues. And it's interesting that France has recently committed more troops to Africa, and that the U.S. has said that it's going to support that French deployment. So I think this is more evidence that all the global players who need energy are going to be staking their claims and supporting various sides in Africa. And that will create a lot of instability.
That's been going on for quite some time, Charles. You're the first one that I've heard really starting to speak out on this, and I agree with you absolutely. The point I would make is China for the last 5 years has been, I won't even say quietly, has been absolutely aggressive in its investment into all of the African countries. Even a few years ago, it was over $100 billion that they were plowing in development as they were creating alliances with most of the countries. The rest of the world just wasn't paying attention. And then we've seen the United States reorganize Central Command because of the African element on it, because of the points that you're making. It's become a lot more strategic. So you've got all these countries that are starting to really focus on this resource center in Africa. And it's going to lead to political, not just instability, but political conflict.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. And if there was any disruption in oil from the major exporting nations in Africa, the U.S. Imports a considerable percentage of its oil from these African nations already. And so there would be a direct economic impact from that kind of conflict or instability should it arise to the point where oil shipments are impaired.
Charles, the point I would make on the oil, remember the U.S. goal here is not that we need the oil or want the oil. It's that what we want and must maintain is that it can only be bought and sold in U.S. dollars. That's where the power needs to be, because then all countries, a huge amount of their balance of trade is energy. But if they were to start being able to buy and sell it in yuan or rubles or something else, the $6 trillion U.S. dollars, and we've talked about this in regards to the Triffin paradox, previous shows, suddenly has to find a home. And it'll come back to America because those are IOUs. So the whole petrodollar strategy that we've had since the early 70s, the oil crisis, is in peril here, and Africa may be the lightning rod for it.
That's an excellent point, that it's not just that we want to import a few billion barrels of oil from Africa for ourselves, is that we need to maintain the entire petrodollar system and make sure that oil flows to our allies and to the stable structure we've created with the petrodollar.
Our listeners who may not be aware, you can only buy and sell oil in the world in U.S. dollars, irrelevant of the U.S. being involved. So I'm a country in Africa and I want to sell it to China. I have to accept it, sell it to them, China in U.S. dollars, which means everybody's got to be dealing with those dollars. And if we remove that, we don't need as many dollars. And that's the problem. And we've been 60 to 70% of the global currency exchange is on the dollars. If you want to know what hyperinflation would look like, if that was to change. And China is clearly gearing it up because they see a threat to their energy supplies, and they're creating all sorts of agreements to be able to use the yuan or the renminbi as a currency. Same with Russia, transacting between Russia and China using the ruble. The issue in Iran right now has been that they have a bourse that they want to sell it in anything other than U.S. dollars. That's the problem. It just doesn't make the front page of the U.S. papers, that's all.
That's right. Other nations have longer-term strategies, and we may start seeing more conflict arising from those.
That's what all this means, conflict. The conflict is building because there's no alternative or solutions that are being put forward or seem to be acceptable to the American government.
Trend number 6 is another trend that's been bubbling along for years, sort of on the back burner, and I'm basically suggesting that perhaps it will come again. It'll move to the front burner, and this is student loans, college debt, and the rising defaults and the rising, just the enormous size of the student debt loans in the U.S., which is exceeding at $1 trillion. So my trend number is the federal government will quietly absorb the rising losses from defaulting student loans rather than reveal the bankruptcy of the entire higher education student loan cartel. And in other words, one way or another, the federal government or the Federal Reserve is going to have to absorb or buy out or bury these $700 billion in federally owned student loans. How they do it, we don't know yet, but something's going to break.
This chart that we have up of the growth in federal loans to students, the only other chart that looks like that would been when I looked at former charts of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that was growing before we went into conservatorship and we took them over. Or I would be looking at the Federal Reserve's balance sheet of its growth. It would look similar to that. So what it's suggesting to me, and that the balance sheets have to keep growing for the central banks, and the Fed is one of them, that we will replace, taper is going to happen. Quantitative easing itself will come to an end, but don't for one moment confuse that with a new program that will be coming out to increase and maintain the growth of the balance sheet and the liquidity. And if I was to call it not quantitative easing QE, but quality education, it'll be an excuse, and we're to invest in the productivity of Americans, etc. But it will be to increase the credit and the flow to another $1 to $2 trillion onto the Fed's balance sheet. And the only option they've got, Charles, that I can see that's blatant is the whole student educational system and auto loans that are also all 90-some% of them are financed by the government currently.
You know, Gordon, I think your quality education equals QE will be very prescient, and maybe we should try to describe a little bit more how that might work. Remember when there was the housing bubble popped in 2008, then the Federal Reserve started buying mortgages, actually mortgage-backed securities, in 2009, and they bought $1 trillion of them, and they're continuing to buy. So that's how they kind of smoothed over the popping of the housing bubble. They just went out and bought almost 10 to 20% of all outstanding mortgages. So it wouldn't be too hard to imagine that the Fed starts buying basically $1 trillion of student loans and then just buries them in their balance sheet.
Exactly. For exactly this similar reason. Otherwise, we'd have everybody out on the street. They were losing their houses. They couldn't make the payments on their mortgages and couldn't afford to have housing dropping down because of collateral values. Well, now, the issue now with student loans is they don't have jobs. They can't get jobs. They can't pay them, so they're going to default. The default rates are already rising up. So same as bailing out a mortgage, you're going to bail out the student loans for the same sort of reason. And you can see it. And these loan growth rates are not going to slow in my mind. I mean, there's ways we can cut educational costs without question, but education is becoming a higher and higher priority. I'm not suggesting we're getting full bang for our buck on it right now, but I think we're still at the tip of where the costs of education are going. Because our education system at the university level, for what it's worth, Charles, I believe is flawed. It was based on a concept that you did research at a university and that the professors would also teach, and your tuition went to pay for the cost of the university. A big part of it was research. They're fundamentally research institutions. But that's not what they should be anymore. I'm not saying we shouldn't have research, but research should be funded by those needing research, and tuition and education should be funded separately. Your tuition shouldn't be going to pay for it. But we can't break it apart. And it's understood, as a professor, you've got to be doing research to write your papers. And in there, we've got this incredible cost structure. And it's a very complex discussion to get into, but it distorts and it puts them in an almost impossible position. And that's where the costs are growing, because the cost of research. It's not the cost of the professor to teach the class. It's the cost of the research that you're having to pay for. Does that make sense to you, Charles?
Absolutely, and it's another one of those legacy systems that the so-called sunk costs. Like, our investment is so huge in our higher education system that people are wary of changing it. But the technology of adaptive learning and massively online shared courses. There's so much technology that can lower the cost that the system is just is not working as it should. It's no longer cost effective. But I want to raise another point that you mentioned earlier, Gordon, which is, what's the collateral on student loans or subprime auto loans, a used car. What we're talking about is extending credit on which has no collateral. I mean, the collateral on student loans is future income of those graduates, assuming they can do it.
Precisely. That's the difference. It's secured on income because it's a non-dischargeable loan. So you could walk from your mortgage on your house and they seized the house, but there was no recourse. Whereas with a student loan, the recourse is they can guarantee your wages. So basically you can't, you're on that hook until you die, until you pay it off. That's called a secured loan when they have the legal right to do that. So that's how they've secured it. And that's unfair.
Yeah.
Because if you can't get the jobs and you can't afford to pay it, and clearly the kids just don't have the means to do it, they can come in and guarantee any wages you can't even live on. Now, there's the realities of the social justice system in here. But that's how they've been able to secure it. And based on that secure, they're able to trade it. Remember, like the mortgage days, they sold off the mortgages, right? So you can sell off things where they're secured this way. So when it starts, the defaults, like on the mortgages, starts to cascade through this pyramid of collateral structures because it was theoretically fully secured.
You've just described a system which is morally rotten to the core.
It's socially wrong. But you see, we have these flawed models that we've fallen into, and it takes brave leadership by our politicians to go to the public and say, these are the changes in what we have to do. And we don't have that.
No,
and when
we
you
do
just
not.
keep kicking the can, you wait for the crisis. And we've clearly got crises. But nobody wants to talk about these things, frankly. And it's not like you have to be a rocket scientist to see it. It's blatant.
I think that's basically an excellent summary of the trends we've been talking about. Is these are all crises bubbling away, and there's been no political or social resolve to even air them honestly, never mind actually try to solve them.
Well, you've referred to them a couple times in previous shows as the untouchables. And a lot of these are social untouchables and political untouchables. And just like our Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid systems that are completely insolvent at $84 trillion, and they're unpayable. But we don't want to talk about how we're going to fix the problem, do we? It couldn't be any bigger an iceberg. And in future generations, they're going to laugh at us. Hopefully they'll be alive. They're going to laugh at just how completely stupid we were.
It's very sad, but I'm absolutely sure you will be correct.
With that happy note, I wish you a Merry Christmas, best of the season. Charles, any last closing comments you'd like to make?
No, Gordon, just thank you for the opportunity to talk about the trends. And if anybody wants to read more of my work, they're welcome to visit me at oftwominds.com.
Look forward to a great 2014 with you. Bye.
Thank you, Gordon.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.